name is Ronen Omer Sherman. I chair Jewish Studies at UofL, and I'm delighted that some of our colleagues in Jewish Studies affiliated faculty are here today. Appreciate their support, and all of you for being here. I think we're giving you something in return that for all of us, one way or another, this is a welcome distraction from the week that lies ahead. I think we're already exhausted by the week that lies ahead. So thank you for coming here. I need to apologize. I really kind of take pride in introducing people properly, especially renowned professors like Dr. Nancy Berg. But the fact that my mom recently went into hospice care and a 5-year-old keeps me up at night, I've just sort of lost that page in which I wanted to cite Nancy Berg's incredible accomplishments. So I'll just say a few words about that. But for those of you, especially in this congregation, who are aware that this event honors the memory, the legacy.
So the folks on YouTube can hear you. Just
just
from the lectern.
Okay.
Just from the lectern.
All right.
Because this microphone.
Oh, the YouTube stuff. Okay, I'm going to grab the book.
Because this microphone will pick you up. Thank you.
So before we bring Dr. Berg up here, I also want to ask Aviv Naamani to say a few words. Just by sheer happenstance, we have the wonderful karma of this event actually falling on Israel Naamani's birthday. But I'll say a few words, then Aviv will come up, and then we will hear from Professor Berg. But I've been reading Professor Berg's scholarship since her incredible book on the Israeli novelist Sami Michael, who was one of the first Mizrahi writers to become well known in this country. And I think her book did a lot to increase awareness of him. And I read her book at the time I was just making my way into his novels. And over the years, I read just about everything that she did, including a wonderful anthology that she co-edited, Anthology of Essays, which is called What We Talk About When We Talk About Hebrew, which is a very interesting collection of essays addressing largely the state of Hebrew culturally and in other ways in this country. And as soon as I saw this new book, Exile and the Jews, Literature, History, and Identity, which seems to me to accomplish something that no other Jewish studies book had even attempted for a very long time at least, in ingathering of essays from different periods, from different perspectives. It's such a rich reading experience, an entire course could be modeled around it. So I was really excited about the opportunity to reach out to her. And for those of you less familiar with her name, she teaches Hebrew and comparative literature at Washington University in St. Louis. And her other books that I haven't mentioned yet include Exile from Exile, wonderful title, Israeli Writers from Iraq. And she also co-edited the award-winning National Jewish Book Award-winning book that I mentioned with Naomi Sokoloff. So she'll be up here in a moment, but I want to also ask Aviv to say a few words about his dad, given that this is Israel Naamani, would have been his birthday. Thanks, Aviv.
I was asked just about, 30 seconds ago, so I don't have anything prepared, but I needed to mention this because I felt this is very important. I just was talking, and there's people in here I've known all my life, literally from the time I was a kid, and I was talking to somebody that was a former student of Dad's. Why is this important that I bring this up? Because initially, the lecture series was held at UofL, and the first lecturers were colleagues of my dad's. People like David Rudovsky from NYU, Menachem Mansour, who was at one point the preeminent Dead Sea scholar in the United States from the University of Wisconsin. But my dad had two careers. He was not just a professor at UofL, no matter how lofty he was. He was also the first director of the Bureau of Jewish Education. Okay? This is why when Ronen started moving the lectures off the U of L campus, I thought it was the best thing. Dad's been gone for 45 years. There's virtually nobody at U of L that remembers him, that knew him. But we got a bunch of people here who knew my dad, who knew my mother, who knew my whole family. And I felt that it was really important, especially on his birthday, to acknowledge the fact that this is where the lecture series belongs. It belongs in the shuls. That was, you know, not just because the people remember him, because my father didn't come here to take a position at U of L. He came here to take a position with the Bureau of Jewish Education. That was his original gig in Louisville. And he started as an assistant professor and worked his way up to full professorship. So at this point, I don't want to talk any further. I just wanted to mention how much it meant to me to be in this, especially in this room, because I got married in this room. My sister got married across the hall. Thank God I only had to stand on stage for an hour while we went through that extravaganza. And my father's funeral was here. So there's a connection to this shul with my family that goes back a long, long time. And at this point, I'm going to cut it off because we're not here to listen to me. We're here to listen to Dr. Berg. And thank you for bearing with me.
Just that, if you didn't notice on the way in, Carmichael's Bookstore, which is a wonderful independent bookstore to support for all reasons, is supporting this event. And those of you curious about acquiring a wonderful book, which is in paperback after the event, I know that Nancy will eagerly sign copies for you. Thank you for coming today.
Well, good afternoon. I want to begin with a little bit of gratitude. I want to thank my hosts for inviting me, to Professor Ronen Omer Sherman, to Cantor Lip, to Nehart for making the arrangements behind the scenes, to Sybil Flora, who was kind to give me rides, and especially to Aviv and Janet Naamani for endowing the lecture. In preparation for my visit, I read a little bit about Dr. Israel Naamani and recognized him as the kind of rare individual who greatly enriches the community in which he lives and beyond. His interests were wide-ranging and included Kurdish Jews, Israeli society, Jewish education, and international law. In 1955, an article in the Courier Journal quoted him as saying, quote, "The international powers must compel the Arabs and Jews to sit down and negotiate a peace treaty," end quote. That is still true to this day. I hope that this talk honors his memory. Now to the preface. I've front-loaded this talk, so don't get worried. You won't be here tonight. The basis of this talk is the anthology that I edited with Mark Saperstein, one of the foremost authorities on the Jewish sermon. It actually began as a course that we co-taught a number of years ago, quite a few years ago, in the former Literature and History program at Washington University in St. Louis. Our starting point was the overall significance of exile as concept and as experience in both Jewish studies and for Jews. As we taught, the story of the Jewish experience has been read as one of exile and redemption, the former of greater interest perhaps in scholarship and text, the latter for the exiled themselves. Many of the texts initially included in our course pack, which was something we did before the digital age, were from Sefer HaAgadah, a masterful anthology of traditional post-biblical narratives, the Book of Legends. To prepare the work, the poet Chaim Nachman Bialik and the journalist Yoshua Rudnitsky had combed through the rabbinic literature, often drawing from volumes that were themselves compendia. And they organized the entire contents, stories, biblical exegesis, extra-biblical legends, sermons, folklore, theology, explications, aspects of contemporary popular religion. They organized all of this thematically, making the selections much more accessible and useful to the average Hebrew reader. By gathering texts from different works, and by collecting and codifying the oral tradition for new generations, the very project of Sefer HaAgadah was a response to the extended Jewish exile and mirrors the reconstruction and restoration of the Jewish people. Mark and I realized that the texts we brought together already constituted a rich collection worthy of a much larger audience. We decided to create what would be the first anthology to examine the Jewish response to exile from the biblical period to our modern day. In concentrating on the multidimensional nature of exile, in examining the tension between contending evaluations of Jewish life in dispersion, and in offering more extensive and varied primary source texts than preceding volumes on the topic, we elucidate the shifting ways in which exile has been conceived throughout the entire sweep of Jewish history. Alongside texts that characterized exile as a kind of death, other texts would explore positive aspects of being dispersed and living as a minority, on the margins, in creative tension with the majority culture, suggesting that exile is necessary for the Jewish people to fulfill its historic mission. It would enable readers to explore how the realities and interpretations of exile have shaped the religion and politics of the Jewish community and individual Jewish identity as well. It would even hint, daringly, that God might be more accessible in exile than in the Temple of Jerusalem. We started on that book many years ago. We thought, we already have the texts. How much work could it be? And 25 years later, we have the book. 25 years later, and many, many rewritings. So, exile, a journalist recently wrote in Haaretz, is all the rage again. I'm going to suggest it has always been central. Exile is a very Jewish story. It is the defining experience of Jews. The pattern of exile and return is foundational. And now my introduction. And hear your heart sink, but I promise. I promise. The majority of the narrative of becoming a nation, as told in the first 5 books of the Bible, takes place in exile. It begins with one story of exile, the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, and ends just before the conclusion of the 40 years wandering after the Egyptian exile. Most of Jewish history takes place in exile. The majority of Jews who have ever lived in exile. The greatest achievements come from exile: the Babylonian Talmud, the prayer service and most of the liturgy, rabbinic Judaism. Exile also rules Jewish practice, at least in terms of the annual calendar. The Jewish holiday cycle is, to a great extent, an exploration and commemoration of the experience of exile. Shavuot, for example, celebrates the giving of the Torah outside of Egypt and the land of Israel. We just observed the fall festival of Sukkot in small booths, recalling the Israelites' experience sheltering in tents while wandering the desert for 40 years. And Passover marks the Israelites' exodus from Egypt in the first step toward redemption. It is the only holiday that marks the transition from exile to wandering and not to homecoming, thus highlighting the complexity of exile. All three of those festivals are the pilgrimage festivals, ironically celebrated by bringing offerings to the temple in Jerusalem, and yet commemorating the experience of life outside of the land of Israel. Tisha B'Av mourns the destruction of the temples, the beginnings of the Babylonian and Roman exiles, the expulsion from Spain. Its polar opposite is Purim, the holiday of joyous indulgence and Megillat Esther. The book of Esther is the only biblical narrative that takes place entirely outside of the land of Israel without any reference to it. It is the most inherently exilic of all the books of the Bible. The heroine of the story lives the life of an exilic Jew, keeping her identity quiet, being known not by her Hebrew name, Hadassah, but by her local name, Esther. In essence, the history of the Jews can also be seen as the history of a people in tension between contending evaluations of Jewish life in dispersion. So this afternoon, I'd like to share a few texts with you to present some of the many faces of exile. I start with the universal, I'll move to specifically Jewish perspectives, and end with the universal. So let's begin with yesterday's Torah portion, which ended with a familiar story. Genesis 11, 1 through 9. And I'm going to read it. Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them hard." Brick served them as stone, and bitumen served them as mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the sky to make a name for ourselves. Else we should be scattered all over the world." And God came down to look at the city and the tower that the mortals had built. And God said, "If as one people with one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. Let us then go down and confound their speech there, so that they shall not understand one another's speech." Thus God scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there God confounded the speech of the whole earth, and from there God scattered them over the face of the whole earth. The Tower of Babel is the third in a series of brief narratives at the beginning of the first book of the Bible that presents the initial paradigm of exile. Adam and Eve are banished, Cain is sentenced to wander, and Babel ends with scattering. In each case, exile is punishment, and a harsh one at that. These three tales also form a progression from interspecial communication. You remember in Eden before the fall, the snakes and humans converse without difficulty. From interspecial communication to the complete confounding of the human language. When the Tower of Babel story begins, there is unification of language, but soon thereafter, God jumbles the tower builder's speech and sends the people into exile. That is, taking away communication and community. The exile is alone and unable to communicate. By one understanding, The punishment of exile was necessary because the builders were rebellious and they had refused to fill the earth. They instead congregated in one space. An alternative reading views the culprits as being too settled, too centralized, and too urban. The picture of bourgeois contentment, where Adam is meant to work the land with great effort, and Cain is to work the land with little reward, the tower builders are even more disconnected from the land. In effect, their sin is one of self-aggrandizement, of not knowing one's place. The story is full of irony, because these people who did not know their place are sent away from the only place they have ever known. The very fear that has motivated them to build the tower, quote, lest we be scattered, is indeed realized as a consequence. Quote, thus the Lord scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth. The poet Amos Neufeld wrote, exile is a kind of dying, one life spinning itself out alone. It is Orpheus descending into hell to emerge alone, knowing that he lives always apart, his world known and lost. It is time and place echoing a world gone, dissonant sounds forever seeking a lost chord, questioning the fate that separates one. Exile is life torn down, surviving as memory, stones and ruins of an ancient city we would rebuild. It is Eden, remembered freshly in the difficult, dark landscape after. And we see that in those three stories, exile does indeed become a kind of death. Adam and Eve become mortal. Cain's wandering is the death of his being in community. The creation of different peoples with different languages at the end of the story of Babel leads to different nations and ultimately to wars between them. While the word exile has generally negative connotations in the English language, its Hebrew equivalent, galut, or in the Ashkenazic Yiddish vuzvuz pronunciations, golus, is even bleaker, evoking associations with a dismal reality, all but devoid of redeeming characteristics. There's a geographical component, Jews forcibly displaced from their ancestral homeland, scattered, dispersed, wandering, homeless, unable to find rest. In addition, the word suggests subjugation and oppression at the hands of the Gentile nations. As a classic study formulates it, quote, persecution, outrage, and injustice from which specious privileges give no relief, end quote. There's a psychological element as well. Galut suggests feelings of shame, humiliation, and suppressed anger before the taunting of enemies and rivals, so poignantly expressed in the mocking challenge of the Babylonian conquerors. Quote, sing us one of those songs of Zion, from Psalm 137. Feelings of guilt because of the sinfulness that, in accordance with the terms of the covenant, initiated the exile and prolonged it. There is a theological dimension. As one celebrated Jewish preacher put it, quote, the essence of our exile, that which pains our souls, is the departure of the Holy Spirit from among us, leaving us unable to sense the presence of our Creator. That is the ultimate anguish and burden of exile, end quote. This negative sense of galut in traditional Jewish literature has been highlighted and accentuated by influential Zionist writers who used it as a foil to delineate all that they rebelled against, the antithesis of their goals and aspirations. While there is little question about the authenticity of such associations, the actual treatment of exile in Jewish literary texts reveals aspects more nuanced and multivalent. The familiar geography of the traditional concept exile as forced removal from the land of Israel, and the end of exile as a return to that land, this familiar geography is occasionally subverted in unexpected ways. Perhaps even more surprising is a revalorization of the concept in which living in the ancestral homeland is no longer automatically identified as good and living outside the land as bad. I'm going to suggest some of these stunning and perhaps surprising permutations of this central concept. Okay. Exile is traditionally seen as punishment for wrongdoing. Where good deeds are amply rewarded, the Hebrew Bible is rife with warnings not to disobey commandments because of the dire consequences. In both Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the comprehensive list of blessings to be bestowed upon those who follow the commandments is followed by a much longer list of curses to befall those who sin. Punishments are increased in severity until exile, the harshest of them all. On the other hand, exile also offers the possibility of atonement. Because exile is such a harsh consequence for transgressing, the experience of exile might shock the offender into awareness of the transgression. As for the individual, exile is seen as the natural consequence for murder, such as in the story of Cain, or the chosen means of atonement. The severity of the sentence is matched by its power. Quote, exile atones for all. More positive readings of exile allow it to be redemptive, whether for the nation or for the individual. And the longer the period of exile, the greater the hope of redemption. Rabbinic literature contains statements recognizing the potential advantages of demographic dispersion among the nations, whether to increase the chances of survival, to attract converts from among the nations, or even to gather support for co-religionists in another part of the world. Medieval Jews used such statements to develop theories of exile as providing opportunities for atonement or even for special mission. In the following passage, we are presented with a more positive aspect of exile, that it can atone for sins that have been committed. The specific examples based on biblical passages may not seem very compelling, but the idea that, presumably in addition to the sorrow of the sinner, the idea that the experience of exile itself can wipe the slate clean could be a source of comfort and reassurance. So this passage is from Sanhedrin 37b, in case you want to look it up. And Rav Yehuda, son of Rabbi Chia, says, exile atones for half of a sin. As initially it is written in the verse concerning Cain that he said, and I shall be a fugitive, na, and a wanderer, vanad, in the earth. And ultimately it is written, and Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod. Rav Yehuda, son of Rabbi Chia, equates Nod with Nad, wanderer, and understands that Cain was given only the punishment of being a wanderer. Exile atoned for half of his sin, thereby negating the punishment of being a fugitive. The passage continues. Rav Yehuda says, exile atones for three matters, i.e., three types of death. As it is stated, so says the Lord, behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death. He that abides in the city shall die by the sword, and by the famine, and by the pestilence. But he that goes out and falls away to the Chaldeans that besiege you, he shall survive, and his life shall be for him for a prey, indicating that exile from Jerusalem will save one from those three deaths, the sword, the famine, the pestilence. And lastly, Rabbi Yochanan says, exile atones for all transgressions, and renders a sinner like a new person, as it is stated concerning the king Jeconiah, a descendant of King David. Quote, so says the Lord, write you this man childless, a man that shall not prosper in his days, for no man of his seed shall prosper, sitting upon the throne of David and ruling any more in Judah. And after Jeconiah was exiled, it is written, quote, and the sons of Jeconiah, the same is Asir, Shealtiel, his son. The verse employs the plural sons of, although he only had one son, Shealtiel. Asir, literally prisoner, teaches that his mother conceived him in prison. Shealtiel, literally planted by God, teaches that God planted him in a way atypical of most plants, hanishtalin, that is, people. A little confusing. The important thing, exile atones for all transgressions. So one of the worst aspects of exile for religious Jews is the banishment from God, or spiritual Jews. The question of whether God accompanied the children of Israel into exile occupies Jewish literature from its beginning. Some commentators view exile as a punitive removal from God's presence, while others recognize the divine as universal and universally accessible. The greatest expression of God's love is said to be the Shekhinah, the divine presence, joining the exiles. Often interpreted as the feminine aspect of God, the Shekhinah speaks to the idea of the temple as God's abode or dwelling place. In exile, the Shekhinah's presence is understood to serve both as consolation and protection. So the word Shekhinah itself does not appear in the Hebrew Bible, but other forms of the root reflect the meaning. As in Exodus 25:8, quote, let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell, vishachanti, among them. Here the teaching concerns the constant presence of God in a unique holy site on earth, in addition to God's existence in the heavens. Later, God's presence would be recognized not only in specific locations where the Jewish people gathered outside of Jerusalem, such as Egypt and Babylon, but wherever Jews lived. Baba Megillah 29a. It has been, I quote, it has been taught, Rabbi Simon ben Yochai said, come and see how beloved are the people of Israel before the Holy One. To every place they were exiled, the Shekhinah is with them. They were exiled to Egypt, the Shekhinah was with them. As it is said, quote, I revealed myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt. They were exiled to Babylon. The Shekhinah was with them. As it is said, quote, for your sake I was sent to Babylon. And when they will be redeemed in the future, the Shekhinah will be with them. As it is said, quote, the Lord thy God returns with your captivity. It does not say here, v'hashiv, and will bring back, but v'shav, and he will return. This teaches us that the Holy One will return with them from the places of exile. And now I move to the section affirmation. There are only a few sections left. A leading influential rabbi in mid-13th century Spain, Moses ben Nachman, frequently known as Nachmanides or Ramban, served as chief rabbi of Catalonia, wrote important books on Talmudic law, and was especially known for his commentary on the 5 books of the Bible, which responded to the commentaries of both Rashi and Abraham ibn Ezra before him. A turning point in his life occurred in 1263, when King James I of Aragon summoned him to represent Judaism in a public debate with Christian intellectuals. And you may remember there were a number of these public debates that occurred in Spain during the not so great period, not so golden era. The crucial question was whether Christian doctrines could be supported by passages in the Talmud. For our purposes, what he said before the king in Barcelona is less relevant than his conception of exile in the literary report of the event that he penned shortly thereafter. For Nachmanides, Jewish suffering stems from being in exile. Jews are derided and taunted by the non-Jews they are forced to live amidst and exist at the mercy of the benevolence of the kings they live under, who may or may not provide them safety. He reasons, however, that as it is more difficult to be Jewish when in exile, so too the reward is greater. Ironically, he himself left exile. The strong attacks on Christian beliefs in his written account of the public debate in Barcelona led to pressure for him to leave the country. He settled in Jerusalem, where he remained for the rest of his life. Here's a brief excerpt from his account. I said, "My Lord King, bear with me a little. The essence of our judgment, truth, and justice does not depend upon the Messiah, the Christian Messiah. You are worth more to me than the Messiah. You are king, he is king. You are a Gentile king, and he is a Jewish king, for the Messiah is but a king of flesh and blood like you. When I worship my Creator in your dominion, exiled, suffering, and in subjugation, the shame of the nations who taunt me always, my reward is abundant, for I bring a whole offering to God from my physical being. Because of that, I shall increasingly merit life in the world to come. However, when a king of Israel of my own faith will rule over all the nations, and I have no choice but to abide the law of the Jews, my reward will not be as abundant." Holier in exile. Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich from the 18th century, was a disciple and then successor of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. The passage below is framed by a novel piece of homiletical exegesis. The opening 3 Hebrew words are usually translated as, "Stay far away from a wicked neighbor." Good advice. In typical Hasidic style, the preacher takes a simple, easily understood, familiar phrase from the classical literature and complicates it, gives it a new twist that nonetheless is firmly rooted in the text. In this case, the Maggid breaks down the traditional syntax of the 3 words, "stay far away," and reconstructs it anew. There is no evil neighbor. The word for evil neighbor is taken, shechein is the indwelling presence of the divine, from Shekhinah. Evil becomes the direct object of the transitive verb harchek, to remove, meaning to set at a distance. Though evil is directly juxtaposed to neighbor in the sentence, the goal is to set distance between them. Evil thoughts must be set at a distance, lest they cause God to be separated from us. The proper translation would therefore be, "Keep evil far away from the divine presence." For Dov Ber, exile is not impediment to holiness, but indeed facilitates its attainment. Using the common analogy of a king to stand in for God, the Maggid of Mezrich explains how it is easier to encounter God in exile and thus achieve the Holy Spirit than it was in the days when the temple was standing. And here I quote, "Hirchek Mishkan Ra." That means that it is easier to achieve the Holy Spirit in our time, a time of exile, than it was in the days when the temple was still standing. To understand this, consider how difficult it would be to approach a king in his royal palace, as compared to when he is traveling through the countryside. While he is on the road or at an inn, anyone can approach him, even a simple farm lad who would never be permitted to enter the palace. In the same way, God will immediately inspire, and dwell within someone who thinks about communion with God now in our time of exile. For this reason, it is important to remove ourselves from evil desires and evil thoughts so that God will not be separated from us. Rather, whatever we do should be for the sake of God's name. Thus, Hirchek Mishkan Ra, remove all evil from the one who dwells within you. And now, back to the universal as a kind of conclusion. In her article from 2013, Out of Exile, Some Thoughts on Exile as a Dynamic Condition, the Polish-Canadian-American writer, Eva Hoffman, writes of changing attitudes toward exile, of the ways in which it has come to be valued, particularly by writers in the postmodern era, and also how it can become a convenient excuse for remaining detached from one's community. In expressing such ambivalence, she engages with the view of exile as an unhealthy choice, whether for the collective as a temptation that, quote, leaves you free to be unimplicated in the mundane problems and conflicts of the place where you actually live, end quote, or for the individual where, quote, the posture of detachment can turn into a kind of willful separatism, the energy of critical distance, into a mannerism. And here I'll quote from her passage. Historically, exile used to be thought of as a tragic or pitiable condition, but recently it has been redefined as somehow interesting, morally heroic, even glamorous. The exilic position is isomorphic with exactly those qualities which are privileged in a certain vein of postmodern theory. Marginality, alterity, the decentered identity. On a more lived level, the situation of the outsider, while hardly easy, has its consolations and even its comforts. It provides not only a ready-made identity, but an explanation for one's existential condition and its discontents. For a writer, there are the considerable advantages of the oblique vantage point, a perspective from which nothing can be taken for granted and everything is strange and new. Indeed, the position of the writer, at least the modernist writer, maps easily onto the position of the outsider. And some writers have famously chosen exile, precisely for the bonus of that sharp angle of vision, the bracing coolness of distance, and defamiliarization. For a while, exile can be a wonderful stimulus to perception and imagination. It can also be an existential challenge and a moral task. And I want to end with another poem by Amos Neufeld, My Difficult Country. The climb, like exile, is always difficult, the distance I have known. The journey, this blind, seeking, sometimes promising, a country of pure vision, the marriage of flesh and peace. Bewildered by the distance, this far away from myself, but still climbing. Jewish identity bears upon the issue of exile only as a contributing factor to the experience, and as a set of cultural codes to express this experience. The traditional mode in which the world is divided into the land of Israel and the Galut has been eclipsed by one in which the world divides into home and exile with a constantly shifting geography. Thank you.
We can probably take a few questions or comments, and maybe
If they're not too hard.
if they're not too hard, and maybe I'll lead off with one. So 25 years is a big span of both of your careers, you and Mark. And was there anything that was really revelatory or startling or surprising in the vast trove of materials you worked through?
Mostly everything. So I had initially asked Professor Saperstein if he would teach a class with me. He's a historian, I'm in literature, because I thought I would learn so much. He's very knowledgeable in Jewish studies. He's probably the world's foremost expert in the Jewish sermon. And his books are like this thick. And I think he's written a dozen or 20, or I've lost track. But I thought I'd learn a lot, and I learned an enormous amount. But we also argued about everything. I discovered that historians liked chronology. They liked to put everything in chronological order. But I like to put things in sort of conceptual order. And so we fought about which materials, how to organize them, how to organize the semester of readings, how to organize each individual class period. And I found these discussions, even when they got heated, brought a lot of light. So I learned an enormous amount. I also kept being reminded how little I knew about Jewish sources, how much there is to learn, and how wonderful some of the stories that we know as children, like Noah's Ark that I spoke about yesterday, or the Tower of Babel. We know these as kids, right? And the actual biblical story is always a little different than the one we have in our picture books. And they're kind of sparse. The Bible is, for as long as it is, it's pretty economical in language. And that's why, of course, we have Midrash, right, to fill in and tell stories. And yet, there's so much in them. And I was surprised by the psychological wisdom of much of what we read and how some of these ancient texts ring so true today. And that there wasn't yes, we have exile and redemption and the land of Israel and we all want to go back and this. But in reality, it's so much more complicated. And exile can be a really generative state of being. And so those were some of the things. That was the short answer.
Thank you. Other questions?
Did you look at, I think I noticed that you had more modern text in this last one, Ava Hoffman was, and what my area is in theater.
Oh, good.
So I think of Angels in America as being one of the most incredible exilic pieces of, you could say, literature as well as theater. The most recent play by Paula Vogel, Indecent.
Yeah.
Also, so much about that and the intersection of Jews and queer communities, so bringing together the ethical as well as internal exile conflicts that are so important and also so much a part of what it means to be a Jew. Exile, identity, memory, all those things going together. And so I think, theater is a very rich place. There's new stuff as well. Leopold Tom Stoppard's new play, all encountering exile, sometimes anew. Stoppard didn't even know, or he says he didn't know he was Jewish. But
It's like David Mamet.
Well, I wish David Mamet did. But that's another story. But, this ongoing identity crisis for Jews is also our existential state of being.
Yeah.
So I think that, kind of supports what you were saying.
So I think the only play that is excerpted here is Joshua Sobel's The Soul of a Jew.
Soul of a Jew, right.
And it was really hard to boil down an excerpt.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of copyright issues too, by the way, and so this complicated the issue that sometimes one had to chop up a text so much to be within the laws of copyright that it just wasn't worth including.
Right.
And so I don't know. It's been a long time since I've seen Angels in America, and it's been about 5 years since I've seen Indecent. I can't think, like, those are great examples, but I don't know if, and I can't say, oh, yes, we thought about them and we just couldn't. I wish I had thought about them.
Okay, we can talk.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that there's an excerpt that would work.
Yeah, there are.
But let's talk.
Sure.
Okay,
Let's do it.
that's for the second volume,
Exactly.
in the next 25 years.
Man, I don't know if I'll hear that.
I don't know that I don't, we don't know.
Next week we won't hear.
You never know.
Other questions or comments? So Dr. Berg is going to be available and signing books if you're interested, which are out just outside. And thank you so much for coming today. It's a gorgeous afternoon.
Thank you.
The beat set was nice. The beat set was good, but I also feel like the level is still okay.